Did you know that the first overall pick in the inaugural NFL draft never actually played a snap in the league? Were you aware that teams used to draft players based on what was written about them in the newspaper? And did you know the NFL almost didn't agree to broadcast the draft on TV because they thought no one would watch it? So how did we get to where we are now? Well, in the early days of the NFL, there was no draft. Teams would just offer contracts to players coming out of college. But the problem with this was it gave smaller teams a huge disadvantage. Popular teams like the Giants and Bears had a lot of money. Because of this, they were able to offer the top college players the biggest contracts to ensure they signed with them. These college players were also able to use the absence of a draft to their advantage. In 1934, University of Minnesota running back Stan Kostka was the best player in the nation. Every NFL team tried to sign him, but Kostka didn't immediately sign with any team. Instead, he held out and watched as the teams entered a bidding war, driving up the value of his contract. After months of holding out, the Brooklyn Dodgers offered the running back a contract that made him the highest paid player in the league at the time. So a year later, during a 1935 league meeting, one of the worst teams in the league decided it was time for a change. Eagles co-owner Bert Bell explained that his team faced difficulties in signing talented players due to a lack of revenue and funds. As a solution, Bell suggested that the league conduct an annual draft, ensuring each team had an equal opportunity to acquire top players for their roster. The NFL owners liked this idea and voted unanimously to create a draft. On February 8th, 1936, the first ever NFL draft was held at the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia. The draft order was determined just like it is today, with the team that had the worst record the previous season getting the first overall pick, and the team that had the best record getting the last pick. So, of course, the team that proposed the draft, the Eagles, held the first overall pick. But besides the draft order, the first ever NFL draft was very different than the one we watch today. The team's owners came together at the first draft and wrote the name of 90 players on a chalkboard. Those names formed the pool of players that teams could choose from. So how did the league come up with this list of names anyway? Well, each team had to submit a list of 10 college seniors they had heard of. And remember, back then there were no combines, scouts, pro days, none of that. So teams decided who to draft based on what they saw in newspaper clippings and heard through word of mouth. The Giants actually drafted a player in the second round because Tim Mara's teenage son, Wellington Mara, told his dad that he saw this fullback play well in a college game. It turns out the teen was right, as the fullback ended up leading the Giants to a championship. With the first overall pick in the inaugural draft, the Eagles selected the first ever Heisman Trophy winner, Jay Berwanger, a running back from the University of Chicago. The Eagles had finally landed a top player, but the problem was he didn't want to play for them, or any team for that matter. Berwanger decided he wanted to pursue a career as a foam rubber salesman instead of an NFL player. But he wasn't the only player in that draft to pass on a pro football career. Of the 81 players selected that year, only 24 went on to play in the NFL. Why? Well, during that time, the NFL didn't pay that much, so players chose more secure traditional jobs where they could earn more. Because many drafted players weren't signing with their teams, the NFL increased the number of draft rounds from 10 in 1937 to 20 in 1939, and then a whopping 30 in 1950. 10 years after the first draft, Rams owner Dan Reeves revolutionized how teams select players. In 1946, he hired the first ever full-time scout, Eddie Codell, with more teams soon following suit. However, just as the NFL was gaining momentum, a rival emerged, the All-American Football Conference. The AAFC began attracting some of the top college players, such as Y.A. Tittle, who chose to sign with an AAFC team rather than an NFL one. To try and combat this, the NFL decided to change up their draft format. In 1947, instead of the worst team getting the first overall pick, they would get the second overall pick. The first overall pick then transitioned into a bonus pick that any team in the league could obtain by winning the lottery. In 1958, the draft was back to its standard format, but there was now a new competitor on the horizon, the AFL. The AFL had a TV deal with NBC, so they had a ton of money to lure the top players away from the NFL. In 1960, the Rams drafted Heisman winner Billy Cannon first overall, but Cannon then went ahead and signed a more lucrative contract with the AFL's Houston Oilers. Then, in 1965, the Cardinals drafted Joe Namath 12th overall, while the Jets took him with the first pick in the AFL draft. Namath chose to sign with the Jets, who made him the highest paid pro football player in history at the time. Eventually, in the late 1960s, the two leagues merged to form the AFC and NFC conferences within the NFL that we know today. During the 1960s, we also saw technology change the way teams selected players. The Cowboys were the first franchise to use computerized scouting. With this cutting-edge technology, the Cowboys drafted 3 Hall of Famers in the 1964 draft alone. 1980 was the most transformative year for the NFL draft. A newly founded cable sports network named ESPN, which had been created just a year earlier, contacted then NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle about broadcasting the draft live. Initially, Rozelle said who would want to watch the draft? But despite his initial skepticism, the commissioner agreed to a deal with ESPN, leading to the first ever live draft broadcast on April 29th, 1980 at 8 o'clock in the morning. Despite the early time slot, the broadcast was a success. Rozelle's doubts were proven wrong, as fans showed significant interest in seeing who their favorite team selected. Throughout the early 2000s, the NFL draft usually started on a Saturday afternoon, but in 2010, the event was finally moved to prime time, kicking off the first round at 8 p.m. on a Thursday night. The move to primetime worked, as a record-breaking 45 million people tuned in to watch across the 7 rounds. The NFL draft has become an in-person spectacle, with hundreds of thousands of fans traveling to witness it firsthand every year. However, in 2020, the draft had to be held from Commissioner Roger Goodell's basement. Surprisingly, this unconventional setup resulted in the highest viewership ever. The 2020 NFL draft still holds the record as the most watched draft in history, with over 55 million people tuning in. The player expected to go number 1 in the 2024 NFL draft is a little controversial in some people's eyes. If you want to learn why, check out this video.